Earlier, I spoke with Frank Sesno, former White House correspondent for CNN, Washington bureau chief, and currently director of the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. Frank, thanks for joining us. Talking about fake news, this is not something that's new. We've seen this for a very long time. We've seen it for decades in these so-called supermarket tabloids like the National Enquirer, which prints bizarre stories. And it's been doing so for a very long time. But now it's become a major issue. What's changed?
Well, what's changed, I think, is when it was in the tabloid and it was fake news, you had to go to it, and you bought it. Now it comes to you. And so the pervasiveness of it, the insidiousness of it, so the tabloid was a gigantic headline and it was attached to a particular brand, and you kind of knew that was fake news. You knew that was tabloid news. Often now it comes and it looks like it belongs to a news organization, or you don't know what the origin of it is, and it's presented in the same kind of way that legitimate news is. So people have a hard time discerning, that's one, what's real and what's not, because it often looks the same. And secondly, it now comes to the consumer. The fake news comes to the consumer. It's no longer merely the consumer saying, this is what I want to go to myself.
I mean, I've just been looking at some figures. Should we be disturbed by the fact that a survey carried out by the New York Times and CBS tells us that 1/3 of the respondents told us that they don't believe either candidate in this last election that they were both dishonest?
Well, we have a lot of different things swirling around here. The lack of confidence in all institutions and in all candidates really is related to this. What the public has said is, I don't believe you. You're not credible. And so what is the baseline of credibility? What constitutes credibility? How does a voter or a news consumer say, this statement or this news or this position is built on facts? And how do we know where those facts and that information actually comes from? So what we really have here, I think, is a crisis of credibility. And that provides the groundwork for these other pieces of incredible news that pile on top of that.
Now, of course, we live in this modern age with social media, online newspapers, apps, curated news. Was there a tipping point where some people lost their faith in journalists?
Well, I would say the mainstream media have contributed to their own crises in many ways, but I don't think they're responsible for fake news. The mainstream media has not hired somebody to sit in a basement in Vancouver or in Abidjan and make up news and throw it into the mix. But what they've done is they've created an environment in which so much of the public is prepared not to believe traditional news organizations that they may be more subject to the garbage that comes across the transom. What it does do, I think, is it challenges mainstream news organizations, legitimate news organizations that pursue journalism and information in traditional ways, profoundly, to explain themselves differently, to make their news and their sourcing and their facts more transparent. So we've got a new dimension here, which is very, very interesting, that falls on mainstream news to express themselves differently, I think.
Now, we see a lot of stuff on Facebook, on Twitter, on Google, things like that. But big news organizations like CNN, the New York Times, they're self-regulating, aren't they? They have big teams of people, copy editors, executive producers, that look at what's going to be broadcast or what's going to be written to make sure that that's the truth, to the extent that they can. You look at Twitter and Facebook, there isn't that group of people, there isn't that level in those organizations.
Right. What we used to say is we had editorial decision makers or gatekeepers at CNN and elsewhere. I was one of them. There were many, many stories that I would kill. Or I would tell a correspondent, you're not ready to go yet because do you have 2 sources or 3 sources or 4 sources? We would decide that we would not report bomb threats. We would decide that there were certain stories that we wouldn't do. And then all of a sudden, what happened is that as the internet rose, is we found that information was coming in spite of us through other sources. And we had to acknowledge that information because if we ignored it, it looked like we were somehow out of it. So the gatekeepers don't exist at the Facebooks and the Twitters. And the Facebooks and the Twitters try to say that they're not media organizations. They're pipelines. They're just pipelines. Don't blame us for what comes through the pipeline. That's not going to hold anymore either. They will be blamed. They are being blamed for what's going through the pipeline. So we're going to get into a new conversation here about who are the gatekeepers, where do they belong, and what are the responsibilities of organizations that in the past have said, we don't need gatekeepers because we're just pipelines.
So I guess the big question is, how does one counter this? How does one fix this? Margaret Sullivan at the Washington Post, she is proposing that an organization like Facebook have an editor, an executive editor. Will that work?
I think the Facebooks and the Googles of the world are going to need to become much more conscious of their responsibility as pipelines. They may not be originating the content, and therefore they're not a media company in the traditional sense of the word, but they are fully responsible if millions of people are using them to obtain bad information and then are making irresponsible decisions or uninformed decisions as a result. Sorry, you're not off the hook. So whether it's a public editor, whether it's a warning or a guidance or a rating system, whether there's a way, you know, when you put a password in, a little bar comes up and tells you whether it's a good password, strong or not. Maybe the same kind of guidance can come up if it's coming through a Facebook or a Twitter. Is this strong or is this weak in terms of the information that's within it? There are ways of doing that and measuring that through the algorithms and where this information is coming from. Whether it's news organizations that are now providing summaries of sourcing at the top of their stories. You know how they have some bullet points now and they will hit the high points of the story? Well, maybe they hit the high points of the sourcing and they make their sourcing more transparent so that news consumers can be more engaged wherever the information is coming from.
Right, but in the online social media world, this would have to be done by machines, human beings. I mean, as you say, millions of people consume this, but millions of people also provide it.
There is no way for a Twitter or for a Facebook to assign a person or a team of people to moderate every single piece of content that gets posted. Think how many pieces get posted to YouTube in a minute or an hour or a day and from how many parts of the world. So no, it's not going to be possible for human beings to sit there and say, check, this is good, let it go, this is bad, kill it.
The point is that we can try and fix this problem. We can try and sift out fake news from real news. But at what point does that clash with the First Amendment?
All over the place. Clashes with the First Amendment. All over the place it's going to clash because it's very easy for us to say, let the good stuff in, let the bad stuff, and keep the bad stuff out. But how do you define that? There is a huge gray area. So if a citizen is writing about something that they have heard in the backyard and they're passing on a rumor that they heard when they went to the school board meeting, if it's just a rumor and there aren't two corroborating sources, is an algorithm going to kill that? Or are you going to put that out there? If there is a terrorist threat and a neighbor has heard about it and they're posting something that they've heard out on the street, but it's not coming from the Ministry of, or the Department of Homeland Security in the case of the United States, does the algorithm kill that? No, it's not going to do that. That defeats the whole purpose of social media. So this becomes colossally difficult in many ways.
Well, it's a very murky area because right now, even if you threaten someone on social media, that's a crime in the United States.
If you threaten someone or if you incite violence or if you do many of these other things, but that's fairly clear. That's fairly clear. The news consumer is going to have to become much more attuned to this. There's much more responsibility on the individual, and how do we convey that to the individual while also having organizations that actually do exist turn this to their advantage. So traditional news organizations and media companies can actually turn this to their advantage. They can use this as a marketing device to say, you know what, we can be trusted. You can trust the information you get from us. And like a bank or like a doctor, that becomes a marketing advantage. So that's something that I think is going to be on the horizon in news organizations and others are going to need to think about.
And of course, there is this other phenomenon of hate speech. Where does hate speech fit into all of this?
Well, hate speech shouldn't fit into this, and hate speech shouldn't be allowed. And social media, Twitter and Facebook and even the LinkedIns of the world are saying we don't have a place for that. Again, the question becomes, how do you define hate speech? I mean, there's the overt, you are fill in the blank ethnic group, you should die. That's pretty clear. No one's going to think that that is not hate speech. That will be filtered out. But again, there are these sort of insightful, insidious kinds of posts that could drive wedges between groups that really are all about hateful activities, but may not be overtly hate speech. How do you find those? How do you filter those? What's the point at which those get deleted? What's the point at which they still constitute free speech? That becomes much more difficult.
You talk about us as journalists attuning to what is disseminated out there. But I was looking at some figures here. Pew Research did a survey last July. It showed that just about 1 in 5 people get their news from social media. That's where a lot of the fake news is being disseminated right now. Does traditional media, journalists like ourselves, need to make a greater effort, put in more effort to persuade audiences to be more discerning about how they consume news?
I think we need to be much better at teaching what constitutes reliable, credible information. We have to have an open and ongoing conversation with our publics about sourcing. Is it a government source? If it's a government source, is this a mediated and manipulated government source, or is it an open government source? Is there someone's name associated with this? Where is their information actually coming from? Is it an anonymous source? If it's an anonymous source, what's the agenda of this anonymous source? Do you have multiple sources? Is it primary source material that can be tracked to an independent group or to primary information gathering, such as the census or some other thing? We, on an ongoing basis, and now probably, arguably, story by story, are going to need to be better at explaining and connecting with the public as to where the information comes from, how transparent it is, whether there are multiple sources, and whether they are at odds or whether they are in agreement. I almost see news consumers now as sort of dug into a news foxhole. And we have incoming from 360 degrees around us. And they're going to have to figure out where the friendly fire is and where the hostile fire is, and manage the friendly fire and try to defend against the hostile fire. And it's going to be very hard.
Frank Sesno, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.